On the morning of December 5th, 2017, something extraordinary happened on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. In a single day, one of Africa's most celebrated companies lost 85% of its value. 200 billion rand, gone. Pension funds wiped out, a billionaire brought to his knees millions of ordinary South Africans who had unknowingly invested their retirement savings into this company, devastated. And the man responsible, he had already disappeared. This is the story of Steinhoff International, Africa's biggest corporate fraud, and the man who pulled it off for over a decade without anyone, not auditors, not banks, not regulators, catching him, until it was too late. To understand how this fraud happened, you first need to understand what Steinhoff was, because on the surface, it looked like one of the greatest African business success stories ever told. Steinhoff International started in 1964, not in South Africa, but in Germany. A man named Bruno Steinhoff started sourcing cheap furniture from communist Eastern Europe and selling it in the West. Smart, simple, profitable. By the 1990s, the company had found its way to South Africa, and that's where the real story begins. In 1998, Steinhoff listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. They were a furniture manufacturer, solid but unremarkable. Then a man named Markus Jooste arrived, and everything changed. By 2017, Steinhoff had become the second largest household goods retailer in the world. Think about that. A South African company, the second biggest of its kind on earth. They owned Conforama, Europe's leading furniture chain. They owned Poundland in the UK. They owned Mattress Firm in the United States, with over 3,400 stores. In Africa, they controlled Pep, Ackermans, Incredible Connection, Russell's, brands that every South African knows. 130,000 employees, operations on 5 continents, listed on both the Johannesburg and Frankfurt stock exchanges. From the outside, Steinhoff looked like a miracle. But miracles in business are almost always a warning sign. Markus Jooste was born in Pretoria in 1961. He studied accounting at Stellenbosch University, one of South Africa's most prestigious institutions, and became a chartered accountant, a numbers man. In 1988, he joined a furniture retailer called Goma Goma as finance director. Not long after, he negotiated the sale of that business to Steinhoff. It was his first major deal, and it got him noticed. By 2000, Jooste was the CEO of Steinhoff International, and for the next 17 years, he would transform it. Jooste was everything South African business culture celebrated. He was aggressive, visionary, and relentlessly ambitious. He moved in elite circles, the so-called Stellenbosch Mafia, alongside legends of South African business like Johan Rupert and Jannie Mouton. He owned racehorses. His cult Variety Club was South African Horse of the Year 2 years in a row. He had a wine farm. He had connections everywhere. By 2016, at the height of his power, Jooste's personal net worth was estimated at 7 billion rand, around $400 million. He was one of the wealthiest people on the continent, and he had a partner, Christo Wiese. If you don't know the name Christo Wiese, he is one of South Africa's most famous billionaires. The man behind Pepkor, the retail empire that owns Pep and Ackermans, the stores that clothe millions of working-class South Africans. In 2014, Jooste pulled off what many called the deal of the century. Steinhoff bought Pepkor from Wiese for 62 billion rand, one of the largest corporate transactions in South African history. Wiese became a 20% shareholder in Steinhoff. His wealth on paper swelled to an estimated 85 billion rand. Jooste was quoted at the time saying, "It makes anything in the world possible for us to do. It's a fairy tale come true." A fairy tale. That word would come back to haunt him. Here is where the story gets extraordinary. While Steinhoff looked like a thriving global empire on the outside, on the inside, Jooste and a small group of close accomplices had been running a massive financial deception. Not for 1 year, not for 5 years, for over a decade. So how did it work? The fraud was complex, involving offshore companies, fake transactions, and phantom revenues. But the core of it was simple. Steinhoff was reporting profits that did not exist. PwC, one of the world's largest accounting firms, was later brought in to investigate. Their finding? An enormous 6.5 billion euros in what they called fictitious and slash or irregular transactions over more than 10 years. In South African rands, at today's rates, we are talking about over 100 billion rand in fake transactions. Here is what Jooste and his team did. They created a network of external companies, secretly controlled by insiders. Steinhoff would then do business with these companies. Fake sales, inflated transactions, loans that were never real. This artificially boosted Steinhoff's revenue and profits on paper. The company looked more profitable than it was. The share price kept rising, investors kept buying, banks kept lending, and Jooste kept acquiring. The brilliant and terrifying part of this fraud was that acquisition was itself a tool for concealment. Every time Steinhoff bought a new company, there was new complexity, new financial structures, and more places to hide the lies. Conforama in Europe, Poundland in the UK, Mattress Firm in America, bought for $3.8 billion in 2016. A price so high, it immediately raised eyebrows on Wall Street. Each deal created noise, and noise is the enemy of scrutiny. Now here is a question that haunts this story. How did nobody catch this? Steinhoff had Deloitte as its auditor, one of the big four global accounting firms. It had a superstar board of directors. It was regulated by the JSE and the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. German prosecutors had actually opened a tax investigation into Steinhoff as far back as September 2015, 2 full years before the collapse. JP Morgan Chase employees had flagged suspicious financial statements as early as 2007, 10 years before the crash. And yet, the fraud continued. The answer, according to investigators, was that Jooste was extraordinarily skilled at managing information. He ran rings around auditors. He manipulated what people saw. He used the complexity of the company's global structure as a weapon. One source described him as increasingly sloppy towards the end, which means for a long time, he wasn't sloppy at all. By late 2017, the walls were closing in. German prosecutors had been quietly building their case. Rumors were circulating in financial circles. A critical report by a German journalist was about to be published, questioning Steinhoff's finances. And then, on December 5, 2017, Jooste resigned as CEO. Without warning, Steinhoff released a statement admitting to accounting irregularities. That's corporate language for the numbers were a lie. The stock market reacted instantly. Steinhoff's share price collapsed 63% in a single day. By the end of that week, it had lost over 85% of its value. A share that had traded at over 90 rand was suddenly worth less than 5 rand. The destruction was staggering. The total losses to investors were eventually calculated at over 250 billion rand, around 14 billion US dollars. Christo Wiese, the billionaire who had trusted Jooste and tied his fortune to Steinhoff, lost an estimated 59 billion rand in weeks. Decades of wealth gone. He later sued Steinhoff for 59 billion rand, claiming he had been misled. The Public Investment Corporation, the body that manages the pension funds of South Africa's government workers, teachers, nurses, and police officers, lost up to 21 billion rand. Let that sink in. The people who had spent their careers serving South Africa, their retirement savings, gone. And Markus Jooste. He disappeared. He went to his farm in Hermanus on the Western Cape Coast and largely vanished from public life. He appeared once in front of a parliamentary inquiry in 2018 and denied knowing about any accounting irregularities. He sat before the country's lawmakers and claimed ignorance. Almost nobody believed him. The years that followed Steinhoff's collapse were a slow, painful reckoning. PwC's full investigation, running to over 7,000 pages, confirmed what many suspected. Jooste, along with 7 close accomplices, had masterminded the fraud. The report took years to be made public after legal battles to suppress it. In March 2024, South Africa's Financial Sector Conduct Authority, the market regulator, fined Jooste 475 million rand, around $25 million, for publishing false and misleading financial statements. It was the largest individual fine in South African financial history, but Jooste never paid it. On the same day the fine was announced, March 21, 2024, Markus Jooste died in Hermanus. He was 63 years old. Reports indicated he died from a gunshot wound. South African broadcaster Newsroom Africa cited sources saying he shot himself during an arrest. The man who had constructed Africa's biggest corporate fraud died before he could face full justice. The company itself, Steinhoff International, was officially delisted from the stock exchange in October 2023, restructured into a new holding company. The brands survived. Pepkor continues to trade strongly. Pepkor operates across Europe. The stores are still open. But Steinhoff, as the world knew it, is gone. So what do we take from this? The Steinhoff scandal teaches us several uncomfortable truths about business, not just in Africa, but everywhere. First, complexity can be a weapon. Steinhoff was so big, so global, and so complicated that the very scale of the company made it hard to scrutinize. Jooste understood this. He used acquisition to create noise. The lesson: when a company grows through acquisition at a pace that nobody can fully explain, be suspicious. Second, prestigious names are not guarantees. Deloitte audited Steinhoff. A board packed with PhDs in accounting oversaw it. The JSE and Frankfurt Stock Exchange listed it. Multiple banks lent it billions. None of them caught the fraud in time. Reputation is not the same as reliability. Third, the real victims are always ordinary people. When we talk about a 250 billion rand fraud, it is easy to think of faceless institutions losing money. But behind every billion, there were teachers and nurses and factory workers who had done nothing wrong, who had simply trusted that the system would protect them. It did not. And fourth, this story is not unique to South Africa. Corporate fraud on this scale has happened in the United States with Enron, in Europe with Wirecard, in Asia with Olympus. The geography changes, the faces change, but the mechanics of the lie, the overstatement of profits, the complexity used to conceal, the brilliant charismatic CEO who eventually runs out of road. These are the same everywhere. Africa is not uniquely corrupt. Africa is not uniquely vulnerable. Africa simply has not yet told its own stories loudly enough. That is what this channel is here to change. The Steinhoff scandal remains to this day the largest corporate fraud in South African history, and one of the largest in the world. 250 billion rand destroyed. Millions of ordinary South Africans hurt. A CEO dead before justice could be fully served. And questions that auditors, regulators, and parliament are still trying to answer. If you found this story as extraordinary as I do, subscribe to Business Africa Explained. Every week, we break down the companies, the tycoons, the industries, and the scandals that are shaping the African continent. Because Africa's business stories deserve to be told, and they deserve to be understood. I'll see you in the next one.